Chapter 2 of Hope and Harmony. A brown hoof dusted off the glossy surface of the record picked up from the royal throne room at Canterlot. As the disc flipped over in the Harmony's cabin lantern light, the white round label came into focus, and the name that was on it read, Octavia, Sweets for a Princess, Sessions 1 through 4. Gently, the fragile object was hoisted over the center spindle of the record player. A cranking sound, and the glossy thing spun liquidly as a needle was lowered into place. A pair of rusted speakers crackled and hissed for a brief moment, then a sweet melody of low-bass cello strings bled through, dancing in the musty air of the swaying gondola. Under the softly lulling rhythms that kissed the bulkheads, the last pony hopped up to a hammock and laid herself down, rocking gently along the starboard side of the lonesome cabin. She tilted one ear toward the music while another kept a diligent check on the hissing sounds coming from the boiler located towards the rear of the craft. A prolonged exhale, and the filly's scarlet eyes pored over the curved ceiling of her floating home. The mare let her gaze dance around the metal beams and iron rivets in a synchronized waltz with the rise and fall of the age-old cello recording. Finally, as the melancholic air around her succumbed to the peaceful melody, she permitted her eyes to shut and her body to drift with the sway of her own tiny world, her hooves resting behind her back and her hairless tail drooping over the side of the hammock. Outside, the gray wasteland howled and spun its endless cyclone of mist and ash. The Harmony hovered bravely in place, a lone copper ballast in a sea of oblivion and snow. The stars above lingered on the edge of perpetual dying, and the black empty earth below yawned for hundreds upon thousands of worthless kilometers. The world of nothing. Equestria. Population 1. Journal entry number 2345. I love music. I don't care how many times I've written it down. I don't care that I will be the only one to read it. I love music. I love its sound. I love its tempo. I love its movements. I love it when it begins. I love it when it ends. I love knowing that there were ponies behind the strings who made this music. I love knowing that they recorded it solely for the sake of sharing their souls, their hopes and their dreams, their fears and their sorrows. I love knowing that, in some way or another, these gifted and masterful ponies are sharing all that they know and love with me, even if it means I am only having a conversation with the dead. A conversation with the dead is better than no conversation at all, and the reason I think I love it the most is because, in a world where there's nothing left to lose, I can remember once more what it means to feel sad. One night, the last pony marched up a snowy hilltop. Behind her, through a sea of flurrying ash, the Harmony could be seen, moored to a trio of burnt-out oak trees. Ahead of her, a mound of crumpled earth buckled under her hooves as she ascended it. Panting, her breath fogging through the misty air, the leather-clad mare came to the top of the crest and gazed down. Her amber goggles reflected a wide graveyard of collapsed buildings and hollowed-out hovels of earth, pony architecture. In the center of the landscape was a clock tower, its circular face spilling rustedly out of the tallest point. The minute and hour hands had fallen to the doughy gray earth countless years ago, forming two stabbing obelisks into the flesh of the dead world. Taking little time to sightsee, the Pegasus pony gently hovered down the slope on cold brown feathers. Landing, she trotted her lonesome way through the ruins of yet another ramshackle village. Her name was Octavia. She was the most gifted cello player in all of Equestria. She performed her masterpiece live, before dukes and duchesses, queens and kings, even Princess Celestia herself in Canterlot Concert Hall. Her symphonies were recorded in mass, and to my delight, I have found one of the discs of her exceptional talent almost everywhere, from the ruins of Cloudsdale to the sunken depths of Manhattan. I have hoarded all of her stuff that I can find, and when I listen to them, pricking my ears to hear beyond even the heavenly layers of her masterful strings, I think I can detect the breaths of the audience in attendance. And when they applaud and when they cheer, I'm there. I'm with them. I am in a concert hall surrounded by thousands of living, breathing, happy ponies. And for a brief moment, I am alive as well. And then the record stops. Inside the collapsed building, she poked through a pile of debris, overturning kitchen utensils, saucers, plates, and other assorted dishes. She briefly plowed a shovel through a pile of papery scraps and unearthed a soup can featuring the image of two smiling illustrated foals. Several cockroaches scurried out of the hollow container and fled towards the ash-splotched walls that were still standing. Ignoring them, she knocked the can upside down with the shovel until 3 lone beans spilled out. A flaring of her nostrils, and she retracted the shovel back to her cylindrical hoofpiece and extended a pair of metal claws in its place. Gently grasping onto the beans, she lifted and deposited each of them into a leather satchel on her saddlebag. Tying it shut, she paced around and marched out the dilapidated house, trotting slowly down the snow-laden stretch of the small city street. The last pony's horseshoes made lonesome omega symbols in the snow as she patted her way towards the half-crumbled library. When I go hunting, I hear Octavia's strings. Her music accompanies me on every trip that I make, on every scavenge that I do, on every deep dive into the darkest catacombs of Equestria. Her magical cello cries and sighs against the pale stone walls of my regular sojourn. And sometimes, in my head at least, I do not feel like I am simply a ghost, the last haunting spectre of Equestria that this holy land has somehow forgotten to exorcise. The world has forsaken me, and so I forsake it, with music. This, of course, is extremely helpful, until I remember that the world doesn't care. The only one who cares, or at least pretends to care, is me, and that doesn't count for much. It doesn't at all. Another night, the Pegasus pony sat on the port side of the Harmony's cabin, her hoof bearing a cylindrical copper sleeve on the end of which rested a freshly inked pen. Bending over her workbench, she proceeded to write her journal entry on the blank page of a dusty leather-bound book that she had found during one fateful trip to a half-collapsed bookstore in the city of Tarantrot. Halfway through her writing, she stretched her shaved mane and upper legs. A long sigh, and she gazed with bored scarlet eyes out the front windshields of the gondola. The world lingered in gray eternity, staring emotionlessly back at her. Another breath, and she returned liquidly to her entry. I know that I have written enough about Octavia, about music, about the only thing that actually has any significance to me. But today, nothing happened. And when I write on the topic of nothing, I inevitably comment on yesterday while simultaneously predicting tomorrow. And yet I still write. I'm sure there was a noble reason for why I began making journal entries in the first place. Quite possibly, when I was still rather new to this world routine, I had the naive hope that everything I put to pen would someday be read by other ponies. But I know that's utter baloney, because I am a pony and I can't bring myself to read the older entries I have made. Still, I am what I am, and that necessitates that I produce something, anything, to prove that I exist. It's the least and yet the most I can do with my presence here on this world, or so I try to tell myself. Thus, as always, here goes. She trotted swiftly down the field of petrified trees, all bent backwards in a fossilized signature of a blast wave having seared them all to ash long ago. A fine blue mist lingered coldly a few centimeters off the once forested floor as the goggled filly shone a pair of glowing lanterns ahead of her. She focused the hazy beams of gold past the gray husks of wood until she narrowed the light onto a pale chunk of stone embedded deep in the sandy black earth. All of the trees leaned away from the alien rock as if it was something venomous. Without a moment's hesitation, the pony galloped up to the thing, knelt down, produced a pickaxe from her saddlebag, and began chipping away until the cold white stone bled forth random nodes of muddy colors. I found several moon rocks this week, 7 to be exact. From them I was able to mine 3 more emeralds, 2 more sapphires, 1 topaz, and a ruby. This fills my spectral stone quota for the signal over the next several storm fronts, with the exception of a flamestone. The one I've got right now is almost out of mana, and I thought I've got plenty of reliable suppliers. Payment is going to be something of an issue, considering I've just recently lost one of my biggest clients, Gilliam, though it is probably more accurate to say that he lost me, and most likely his life in the ensuing altercation. Finding creatures willing to pay me in silver strips for random tasks is going to be a bit difficult if I can no longer trust in diamond dogs to hire me. I can only hope that many of the canines unaffiliated with Gilliam's dirigible crew were still willing to do business. But I fear that the damage is done. Tick off one dog, and you've likely petted the entire pack the wrong way. That's what I get for trying to survive at Gilliam's behest. They say that history is made by the victors, but triumphant as I may have been as of late, I am still only one pony. History only pays attention to those who survive by their seed, and on that front I'm doubly screwed. Minding the cockpit of the Harmony, The pony squinted hard at a leather pull-down map of Equestria, scribbled and painted over in several dozen places with apocalyptic alterations. After gazing at a circle that had been scribbled next to an eastern mountain range, she snapped the map back up into its holster and lowered her amber goggles. Shoving a pair of levers forward, she accelerated the Zeppelin and watched as the mist beyond the windshield parted, timely revealing a horizon of shattered skyscrapers looming before her. Carefully, the pilot navigated the ghostly spires of Philadelphia. The copper-colored ship dipped low, passing between enormous building after building up in the abandoned metropolis, swooping briefly under a pair of crumbling towers that had collapsed into each other to form a quivering arch of steel and concrete. Landing in a cobblestone town square filled with randomly overturned stagecoaches, the pony moored the Harmony and stepped out on the hoof, holstering a rifle before exploring the ruins to her immediate north. I'm always hunting, always scavenging, always clawing at the tomb of Equestria for things that I need. I can't remember a time when I was not searching, fishing, or scrounging. In this wasteland, being still means being useless. And if there's anything I hate more than being alone, it's being useless. I've broken into homes, kicked in the doors to shrines, broken into banks, smashed urns apart, and even pilfered the storage lockers of hospitals. Nothing can be overlooked. Nothing must be wasted. I have to remember that there is one important thing, something that is more important than one's pride, something that is more important than one's ethics, something that is more important than learning to love or hate oneself when trying in vain to fall into the bitter arms of sleep. And that something is my life. Be it long or short, it is the only life that will ever mean anything to me. It is the only life that matters in Equestria. Period. A pair of lantern lights shimmered over a brass pony statue, blindfolded, rearing its hooves and carrying a rusted pair of iron scales. The leather-armored filly trotted slowly down the abandoned courtroom. Her goggled eyes glanced back and forth. She spotted a door behind the judge's seat. The shadows of the courtroom seats bobbed and weaved as she strolled towards the far end of the room, nudged her way through the collapsed doorframe, and stumbled upon a musty office full of dust and sediment. A gentle flurry of snow, and the pony was graced with a pair of shattered windows overlooking the dead lengths of Philadelphian skyscrapers looming several stories below. But that wasn't what caught her attention. The pony made a straight line for a pile of collapsed books lying beneath an overturned set of wooden shelves. Flipping through the pages with a metal-laced hoof, she raised her goggles, squinted at the words, and proceeded to store a good chunk of the literature in her saddlebag. Books. Books are the hardest thing to salvage. A part of me knows that I must do something, anything, to preserve as many written words as I can. I'm not the only scavenging creature in the wastes of Equestria, and I know that any literature of ponydom will be utter garbage to dog, goblin, or monkey kind. But I only have so much room in my saddlebags, and even less weight for Harmony to handle. On top of that, there is something I know I need more than words, and that's warmth. Tragically, many pages serve better use in the boiler. But the ones that are special, or at least the ones I feel are most important to the history of the equestrian spirit, I keep. That's a tough thing to think about. All of our history, all of our lives, all that we've ever done or accomplished shall have its merit determined through the filter of my lonesome approval. That's the one thing I never expected to have on my shoulders. Then again, I never expected to have any of this on my shoulders. What I haven't gotten from experience, I've gotten from books. How to keep a fire going, how to keep a healthy diet, how to maintain the structured integrity of a Zeppelin, how to filter steam through a steady pipeline, how to do anything to keep oneself alive without anyone to tell me by ear. I have learned to teach myself by eye. Books have been my greatest teachers in a world without mentors. The writings of Aristotle, Camus, Nietzsche, Descartes, I have devoured all of their words, made many of them my own, developed a writing style so as to have dissertations with long-dead phantoms. It's funny, because I was never too keen on reading or learning when I was a little filly. And then when I was thrown into the world beyond the cataclysm, it was a titanic struggle to teach myself the vocabulary I did not yet understand. I accomplished most of this by reading simple books and jumping immediately to the more complicated ones, so that the meanings of things bled their way into my mind between the cracks of definition. Many things in my life like this I had to overcome by learning them on my lonesome. In so many ways, it has always been like this, even before the cataclysm. Perhaps I was the most fortunate pony in all of Equestria to end up being so unfortunate. "Hedgem," she uttered. A runestone dimmed, unlocking a sealed bookshelf lying against the Harmony starboard side. The compartment opened, revealing half a dozen rows of thick, leather-bound books. Still shaking the fresh ash and snow off her armored flanks, she reached into her saddlebag, grabbed a few new volumes in her snout, and shelved them with the rest. Taking a breath, she stepped back and gazed forlornly at the quiet rows of tomes, until her goggled eyes rested on two large books, the largest in her library by far, resting on the top rightmost shelf. Two crests were emblazoned across their spines, plastered in gold and silver respectively. The sun and the moon. Two books, in particular, I know I will preserve with every fiber of my existence. The sacred words of the equestrian princesses, journals kept by Celestia herself, and a much similar diary maintained by Luna. I found the two of them on my second trip to Canterlot. Enough time had passed for me to embrace the present darkness, and I took it upon myself to commit the unthinkable. I looted the royal palace. What I once thought was a crime turned out to be the most noble thing I had ever done. Because where is there a better place for the exalted pony family legacy to reside, but in the safety of the flying hovel of their last royal subject ever? Luna's book is barely filled, mostly blank pages, on the account that she was bequeathed the journal shortly after returning from her imprisonment in The Mare and the Moon, which was ironically just before the cataclysm. But Princess Celestia's book, it is an indescribable masterpiece of poetry. As another record of Octavia's strings sang to the lantern-lit air, the pony squatted into her swaying hammock upon folded legs. Celestia's golden book was carefully laid out before her. With her goggles pulled up, the last pony's scarlet eyes liquidly melted over the finely woven starlit calligraphy. A lump formed in her throat as she inhaled sharply and turned a page, a thick and focused pulse stretching visibly beneath her brown coat. She writes of joy. She writes of hope. She writes of royal subjects in their daily lives, of magical apprentices and their friendship. Most of all, she writes of her sister, of the hole left in her life during Luna's 1,000-year absence, and subsequently the immeasurable rapture of embracing her beloved sister's return. In almost every entry that Princess Celestia had ever made, she was full of optimism, anticipating the joy and prosperity that the next sun-raising would bring. When I first read her books, I was hoping to find a sign, any sign, that would suggest that Celestia at least expected the coming cataclysm that would end all of ponydom in Equestria, including the lives of her and her sister. What I found instead were a few entries of the deepest, most overwhelming sorrow I could come to expect from any pony, much less the goddess of the sun. I had always known that Princess Celestia was immortal, but what I didn't know were the repercussions that came with such a long life. Of loved ones beneath her protective wings who would die in waves over the passing centuries, of friendships and alliances that started, blossomed, and withered away in as little time as it took the royal princess to blink. I have read those entries of hers, the sad ones, thousands of times more than her happy ones, because I soon came to realize that I was the only Pegasus in the history of existence who could, in some fashion or another, relate to her. The only difference is, of course, no pony is going to read about my losses, like I have faithfully read all about hers. Transcending the cloudy overcast of the world, above the ashen snowfall, the last pony clung to the outside of the Harmony. Angling her wings back to steady herself in the high winds, she hissed through clenched teeth that tightly gripped a welding tool. She expertly climbed the outer rungs encasing the copper leather body of the Zeppelin's starboard side. Finally, the Pegasus zeroed in on the source of a loud rattling noise that had been bothering her for several days. Tightening her goggles and tinting the lenses, she aimed a welding torch at the bulkhead and fused a new cluster of rivets into place. Sparks fell through the bone-cold grayness and fluttered past the swaying gondola of the Harmony below. After the welding task was done, she re-gripped the welding tool and waved her wings into the air. Swiftly, she started to dart up the very top of the Zeppelin and hovered down onto the center of the balloon's chassis, where a pair of crisscrossing bulkheads had rattled loose. Gripping herself, she grabbed a few more rivets from her saddlebag and welded them into the right places, tightening the outer framework of the copper airship and silencing the rattler noise for the time being. A deep breath, and the pony briefly sat down on the roof of her lone, hovering vessel. She had no reason to stay there, but something possessed her to delay flying back to the aperture entrance of her hangar bay below. Gazing straight up, she briefly raised her goggles and gazed with naked scarlet eyes, watching as twinkling specks of sickly pale light hovered far above the miasma of the dead globe. A breath escaped the pony's nostrils, but try as she might, she could not tear her lonely gaze away from the horrendous abyss that perpetually engulfed her. There is no sun, there is no moon, there is only ash and perpetual twilight. It isn't day, it isn't night either. The roof of the world remains lit, but fails to snuff itself completely out. It's as if the distant stars are half-heartedly attempting to make up for the celestial bodies that the princess used to maintain over Equestria, bodies that are gone forever. In the end, the result is a constant and unending haze of dimness, as if to gaze towards the sky is to look out through the eyes of an elderly mare on her deathbed. Any second, any heartbeat, and everything should go dark, and yet it doesn't. Sometimes when I sleep, or try to sleep, and the great gray glow continues its pale dance beyond the portholes of the harmony, I beg for darkness. I beg for the end of all things, but I stop myself every time. To ask for the end is to give up, and that is not a luxury I can afford. The darkness will come, some way or another, some time or another, but until then, I can't even pretend to know the time nor the place. I can't even track time efficiently. All I remember is that I was young when the cataclysm happened. Since then, there has been no sunrise or no moonfall. Hours are your only friend. Everything else is an imaginative figure. In the land of twilight, you have no definition of age. At some point, when I realized the lightning storms over the wasteland transpired at regular intervals, it occurred to me that I should try and measure the passage of time. After finding several miraculously preserved hourglasses in an abandoned Winnipeg laboratory, I timed the number of occasions I had to rotate them between the regular lightning storms. I found that the time between these weather patterns averaged out to approximately 120 hours. If the average equestrian day was, as I read it was, 24 hours, then that meant that there were 5 days in between regular lightning storms, almost enough to fashion a new week by. And if there were 365 days in an equestrian year, then that meant approximately 75 storms marked out a year. Since I began this experiment, I have counted a total of 1,358 lightning storms. Ultimately, that means I've been living in the wasteland for well over 18 years. I am certainly not a young filly anymore, but then again, I hardly remember how long I was young for. After mooring the Harmony to a jutting spire of rock, the Pegasus descended and trotted through a grand forest at the bottom of a snow-laden plain. But the large gray bodies that drifted past either side of her weren't trees. They were mushrooms. Giant, 6-meter-tall stalks of fungi swayed and bowed in the cold wind. The last pony marched until she was within hoof's length of a knee-high mushroom. After depositing her saddlebags onto a gray patch of earth and mulch, she produced a long blade from her pack, slapped it hard into the neck of the gigantic mushroom, and began viciously sawing through the body of the thing. After the structure fell loose, she quickly produced a sharp brass claw and approached the hollow of the thing. Positioning a gas lantern to shine its golden glow into the cylindrical body of the mushroom stalk, she dug her snout in, teeth gripping the claw, and began carving loose several rubbery flanks of fungal material. These she stuck into a leather pouch, tied it shut, and dragged the saw blade towards yet another knee-high mushroom to repeat the entire procedure, all the while under a gentle rain of powdery snow.